Right, great.
Yeah.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name's Tom Jenkins. I'm being joined by Robin Stencil, our ambassador in North America. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to this America group. We're going to be looking at the situation in, obviously, North America now that the season is fully underway. I imagine that the conversation is now entirely reliant on people posting questions. So please post questions in the questions box. It enables us to pad out the conversation rather. I mean, actually have some real things that we can try and answer in the conversation rather than just thinking about the things that we've got directly in front of our nose. But before I start getting into that, I'm actually delighted that David Edwards, ETOA's own statistical guru, cannot make it today, but he's done a pre-recorded statement. So we're going to listen to that before we proceed. Do we have sound? Paul, who's our guru in the background, alas, we appear to have no sound. Can you hear anything, Robin? No, I can't hear anything either. I think we got no sound again. This is a problem that has plagued our Zoom presentation, so we thought we'd solved it. I think if you, what I'm going to do, Paul, is I will try and pull up the slide presentation that David prepared.
Let me try again.
Well, let's try again.
Pandemic has reached
New
Well, hello. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to be sharing some data and insights relating to the North America market. We'll begin with some UNWTO figures on the number of outbound departures from each of the US and Canada. So what do we see? Well, starting with the US, the red line on the chart, we can see that it was very steady growth for most of the period from the mid-90s through to about 2012, 2013, and then a real uptick in that outbound departure rate. Then, of course, came the pandemic, but what we can see is that outbound travel from the US post-pandemic has reached new highs. Whereas for Canada, there's the blue line, we can see it was fairly steady growth during the early noughties, but then plateauing ahead of the pandemic. Certainly, the Canadian outbound departures have recouped all of those pandemic losses, but they've not grown by the same rate as seen from the US. That's volume. If we look at value, then in 2023, the US was the world's second most valuable outbound source market for international tourism, and Canada was the seventh most valuable. So what proportion of those outbound departures are heading for Europe? So this is analysis by Tourism Economics published by the European Travel Commission. And we've got the estimates for 2019, for last year, and their forecast for 2029. So this reveals that close to 3 in 10 outbound departures from the US are heading to Europe, whereas it's about 2 in every 10 from Canada. And to underscore just how important the US market is for Europe, we can see that the US accounts for more than 1 in 3 of all long-haul visitor arrivals to the continent. So that's a share of outbound departures to Europe. What about recent and forecast growth? So here we're looking at the period 2019 to 2024, the left-hand bars, and then the next 5 years over on the right-hand side. Again, Tourism Economics forecast published by ETC. So over the past few years, we've seen number of arrivals from the US to Europe grow by more than a fifth, and from Canada by about 16%. And looking ahead for the next 5 years, well, we can say that we can look forward to similar levels of growth. However, we do need to note, of course, that the future is a little bit more uncertain than the past. A really good source of data on the travel by American citizens to Europe is the US International Trade Administration. And the chart that we're looking at here is telling us how many American citizens get on a plane somewhere in America that's going to land in Europe. This is the rolling 12-month tally right through to May of this year. And again, we can see that the line is in record territory. Looking at 2025, well, there's been 6% year-on-year growth across the first 5 months, and if we're just looking at the month of May. So this is telling us that at least so far in 2025, Americans have definitely not lost their appetite for travel to Europe. Time for a chart on demographics. Here I'm showing you the age distribution of both the US and Canada, and we can see that the two bars look broadly similar. However, we can see that the US is a slightly younger population than is that in Canada, but the differences are relatively negligible. However, what it's worth saying is that over the past 5 years, the population of both these markets has grown significantly, but that's primarily been down to international migration as opposed to what is called natural change. Looking at the two states within the US that have seen the strongest absolute growth in population, while roughly 2 million more citizens in each of Florida and Texas since 2020. On to economics. So these are estimates and forecasts from the International Monetary Fund for GDP growth in each of the two markets. So we're able to spot that the US is forecast to grow at a slightly faster rate than is Canada. Now these forecasts were published in April by the IMF, and they were definitely a downgrade on their forecasts made back at the start of this year. The IMF also reckon that there is a 40% chance of a recession in the US this year, and just last week Moody's downgraded the US's credit rating due to concerns about the spiralling scale of national debt. That said, separate data from Capgemini reminds us that the number of high net worth individuals in the US surged by 7.6% last year, whereas in Canada it was a slightly more modest growth rate of 2.4%. But American consumers are feeling a bit skittish. This is the long-running OECD measure of consumer confidence in the US over the past 5 decades. And we can certainly spot over on the far right-hand side of our chart that the last few months have been characterized by a rather precipitous fall. And in fact, the May data reading was the lowest on record for consumer confidence in the US. One factor that impacts travel to foreign places is how affordable the currency of that place is for those planning a visit. So here we're looking at the cost of buying a pound, the red line, or a euro, the blue line, for those using the US dollar. If the lines are going down, it's getting cheaper. If they're going up, it's getting pricier. So we can see that the past couple of years have been typified by coming to Europe being quite a lot more affordable than it was 10, 12 years ago. However, the far right-hand side of the chart reveals the last few months has seen a rather steep increase in how much it is costing Americans to buy either pounds or euros. So that may dent how much they spend when they're here, even if it doesn't dissuade them from visiting. Let's look at exactly the same chart, but here it's for those using the Canadian dollar. Rather more dramatic change when we see the red line, so the cost of sterling for those visiting from Canada, than those visiting somewhere where the euro is the currency. Once again, though, we can see that the last few years have been rather cheaper than start of the century. However, over the past year or so, it's definitely been getting more expensive for Canadians to buy, particularly sterling, but also to an extent euros. So lots of economic stuff there, but what really motivates visitors from the US and Canada to travel around the world? Well, back in 2022, Visit Britain undertook a piece of research that asked potential travellers to think about a whole barrage of statements and then say how important they were in choosing a destination. So let's look at the top 5. starting with the US. So we can see that somewhere being welcoming is really very important ahead of it being easy to get around once you've arrived. It's somewhere with lots of history and heritage, countryside and coastline to enjoy, and also somewhere that offers good value for money. When it comes to those from Canada, it's not too dissimilar, but it's up at the top. We see good value for money. Then again, important to be welcoming, easy to get around, coast and countryside that's beautiful, but also the ease of being able to explore lots of different places when they're on a visit. Now you can be as motivated as you want, but unless you've got a passport, you probably can't leave your own country, especially if you're an American. So the chart here is looking at the number of valid US passport books or passport cards in circulations. But despite the upward trend that's clearly apparent, what we can see is that only about 48%, so less than half of Americans, own a valid passport, whereas the equivalent metric for Canadians, that's rather a lot higher at 67%. A couple of years ago, the European Travel Commission did a piece of research across various long-haul markets, including the US and Canada. And one of the things they quizzed potential travellers about was whether or not they would prioritise speed and comfort when travelling, or whether they would be happy to travel more slowly in order to minimise their carbon footprint. Here's the answer. And we can see that 7 out of 10 Americans said, I'm going to prioritise speed and comfort. And it was 6 in 10 Canadians who said it's speed and comfort that matters rather more than minimising carbon footprint. In any given year, there's always stuff that happens that's going to impact tourism. But let's look ahead to 2026 and a couple of events that may well play a role. So the US will celebrate the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence next year. And that, of course, may entice some Americans to take a domestic rather than a foreign vacation. Also next year, the FIFA Men's World Cup is taking place between the 11th of June and the 19th of July. There will be matches in each of Canada and Mexico, but most matches will be happening in cities in the US. And that could well have at least a short-term impact on the availability and fares for transatlantic travel during what is traditionally a very busy time of year. Final slide, geopolitics, because there's an awful lot of it about at the present time. So in April, visits to Canada by Americans travelling by air witnessed an annual decline of 5.5%. While the number visiting by automobile, that fell by rather more, 10.7%. Meanwhile, the April stats for Canadians returning from a visit to the USA indicate a fall of 19.9% of those whose mode of travel was air, and by 35.2% for those using an automobile. Now, a small proportion of those who might have travelled north or south for an international leisure trip might, just might, consider travelling east across the Atlantic to visit Europe instead. So a potential fillip for Europe there. But of course, equally, those folks might decide to holiday domestically or to travel west across the Pacific or just fly over the US down to Latin America. However, if tariffs do result in there being less global trade, then that will result in an economic slowdown. And that, of course, could dampen demand for international and indeed transatlantic business travel. And business travel certainly extremely important to all those carriers flying across the Atlantic. So that's me done. Enjoy the rest of the session. If you have been, thank you for listening and goodbye.
Wow. Well, thank you, David. In absence to that, as ever, was a very lucid and clear indication of what's happening. I think the things I would stress is that one of the things to note about the reason why a slightly smaller proportion of Canadians coming over to Europe than Americans coming to Europe because obviously Canadians have got the option to go to the USA, which used to be a huge, obviously the overwhelming destination for Canadian citizens. So it's a slightly skewed statistic that. And the information that we're getting at the moment is that the demand for the USA and Canada has dropped really rather dramatically, and that many Canadians are opting to come to Europe instead. I think it's indeed a general pattern at the moment. The one thing I could do is note that the statistic that David showed, showing a growth which was starting to plateau up to May, was of departures in that period, not forward bookings. And my understanding, and it's it's open to question. Indeed, there may be people here who can correct me on this, but my understanding is that the demand for Europe started petering out fairly rapidly after the presidential inauguration in February. And the predictions we've got for most of the main scheduled operators is that we're looking at roughly 90% of last year's business. It's around that level. It ought to be said that this is in the context of really healthy bookings. People were confident that they were going to be up on 2024 this year, and bookings were running ahead of 2024. And so they managed to assemble most of the bookings that they needed, and the bulk of the booking period was running very strongly. It's just after February, March, April, May, we've really seen a petering out of what was an enormous surge before that. I don't know if this is reflected in the information you have, Robin.
Yeah, I would say that's the trend that we've been seeing. And like you said, even though it's slowed down for 2026 bookings, it's still on target to be another crackerjack year, with numbers up where they should be.
I think it's totally contingent on where partly what you're selling. I think there is undoubtedly stronger demand for continental Europe, particularly continental southern Europe, Italy in particular, than there is for the UK and Ireland at the moment. I think we're also there are many operators who actually sold out or claim to have sold out their capacity in the period prior to February. They actually had full books by that stage. So I think I think what we're looking at, particularly when it comes to the escorted terms, is that most areas will see a good year, but they won't see a bonanza year. And it's possible in the UK and Ireland, not being down on the UK and Ireland, but they're slightly separate phenomenon, that they'll see a slight reduction in volumes over last year, but nothing dramatic, and still well ahead of where we were in 2019. So I mean that's the general booking pattern. Is there anything else to be said about it, Robin?
I agree with you. I think looking at 2025 versus 2024 might be a little bit more flat, but when you compare to previous years like 2023 or like you said 2019, it's still on the trajectory of an upward growth. Something else just to point out, because you had talked about the Southern Mediterranean, Europe, Alaska Airlines just opened their new route direct from Seattle to Rome. So actually that could impact the way that people get to the Mediterranean, because there aren't a lot of direct flights right now that take you directly to the Med. So that could be something that increases demand or increases incoming travelers to that part of Europe.
Indeed, and we have to look at it reciprocally as well. There may even be people going from Rome up to Seattle. We never know. Things could be happening. Just a couple of news stories, really. I just to stress since the last time we were here. I think that you probably know that the ETOA is in operation in the UK now. This seems to be going fairly smoothly. It might be a reason that there's a slightly more suppressed demand for the UK than the rest of Europe. I don't know, but certainly we're having no complaints about the way it's working. And in many ways, it duplicates, as we know, it duplicates what visitors to the United States have to do when they have to get nested. But that's gone, touch wood, fairly smoothly. The European Union is supposed to be introducing its own version of this, which is the ETIAS, and everybody here will surely know, but needs to be reminded, that this is a long way from implementation. They're having a real difficulty implementing the predecessor of the ETIAS, which is even before they start issuing electronic travel authorizations. They need to have an effective electronic entry and exit system. And this they're struggling to introduce. And they've declared that from April of this year, so it's in theory been in operation for 2 months, they're having a partial rollout of this system. Now, anybody will notice that if you're having a system that controls the entry into a block, you can't have a partial system. So, but this is what they're trying to do. They're trying to prove that the registration of people works, even if it's only a partial registration. So, arriving in Europe, you will find that you still have to line up and you still have to have your passport wet stamped. But you may also find yourself being registered on an electronic database simultaneously. Again, there is nothing to worry about. There's nothing you have to do beyond, over and above what you had to do previously. It's just a process by which they're trying to get all the border agencies of all the constituent countries of the Schengen area agreeing to implement the electronic system. I think that they're hoping that it will be completed by April 26. There's a 6-month grace period, not more than a grace period. There's a 6-month period when they're working this electronic entry system. And then after 6 months, they'll start to roll out the electronic, the ETIAS, where you will have to pre-register and pay a fee. So I don't think we're going to be affected by this much before the end of 2026. So this is not something that we need to be too worried about, but things can change, and we will keep watching and keeping everyone informed. The other point, just to raise it, those of you who do Venice, you should know that the Basilica di San Marco, which is one of the great sites of Venice, has suddenly declared that they're no longer issuing admission tickets on the door. Everything has to be pre-booked. And if you're bringing a group, that group has to be pre-booked by a tour operator who's registered as a tour operator with the authorities. This, in theory, had to take place before the beginning of this month, or on the beginning of this month. We await to see how this works. We're not sure how it's going to work. We're not sure if it's going to work. But at any rate, they're determined to roll this forward. So if you're operating in Venice, you need to look at our website where it will explain everything that's happening. Is there any other news, Robin, that we need to share?
I can't think of any.
Okay, I have what looks like a question popping up. One moment. I've got someone's just saying, I think it's we've noticed the decline in US visitors booking day trips from London to Stonehenge. Are there any specific trends in the US traveller behaviour, such as a shift towards shorter stays, fewer inclusions, or more independent travel that could explain this, or is it just less visitors from the USA? Have you got an explanation as to why fewer people are going to Stonehenge on day trips?
I can't think, I mean, unless it's easier for them to do it on their own and they don't feel like they need to have a booked excursion, but I don't know if there's a new transportation that makes it easier. I can't think of anything. We haven't had any kind of recent anniversaries around Stonehenge, so I can't think of a reason why it would be declining.
No, I can't think either. The one thing I would assure you is that it's actually notoriously difficult to get to by train. You can do it, but the Stonehenge is one of the alpha UNESCO World Heritage Sites where you really do have to take either an escorted tour or an excursion, or indeed hire a car, which I wouldn't recommend. but it's difficult to get to otherwise. Sorry, you're about to say
Yeah.
something.
So that hypothesis is out the window. Something that I see over and over and over again is Americans or travelers in general wanting experiential travel now. Like that's top of the list, top of the mind. So I don't know, maybe Stonehenge isn't experiential enough now. Maybe people are more interested in doing hands-on activities or demonstrations. I don't know. I would still want to go. I don't know what I can't think of a trend that says that Americans specifically are opting for fewer excursions. It could just be an anomaly.
As I said before, what we're looking at is potentially a decline in the UK and the American market of around about 10%. But this is anecdotal. It's just the people I've talked to.
Yeah.
They're saying this is what they're seeing. And it's possible that's being expressed. It's possible also that the dollar has depreciated slightly against the pound and then less taking excursions from London. It's a very interesting, but it may be an interesting straw in the wind. We simply don't know what the import of this is. The idea of experiential time at Stonehenge, to give them full justice, there's an excellent visitor centre there now, which they've dramatically improved since the last time. But they can't really change Stonehenge. I mean, it has. There are people who feel it could do with a lick of paint, but I mean, there's not much to be done there, particularly on the experience level, unless you're seriously getting into recreating religious practices of 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. But we can try. We can try. Okay. I'm trying to think if there's anything else we've got. We've got no more questions, I believe. I'm just intrigued. I mean, one of the points that was raised by David was that people were at least prepared to consider being more environmentally friendly than over speed and comfort. The acid question that's there is, in terms of pleasure, the quality of the experience and price. So these are the things that seem to be more important. Is that me being cynical, Robin, or is that still sort of overwhelmingly the case?
I don't think it's cynical. I think in theory, people want to be more carbon neutral or offset carbon or environmentally friendly. In practice, it's not always easy to know if the vendors or the places that you're choosing are offering that. It takes a little bit more detective work to say, okay, wait a minute. Can I find a hotel that's not only in the neighborhood I want to sleep in the budget that I have, but how can I make sure that that hotel is practicing, proper green travel? And so I think if you were to just ask someone, do you care about the environment and the planet, and do you want to travel in a way that's more sustainable? People will say yes, but it's hard in practice to go actually do that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's still unfortunately at the moment one of the areas where there are people who are genuinely concerned and genuinely interested in having holidays which conform to a whole series of sustainable metrics, and there's a lot of people who regard it as a consideration, but unfortunately, vacations tend to be something that people consider this is the moment where they let their hair down. And this may well be one of those moments. There are instances of people bringing new standards of behavior to a destination. It's not always the case that tourists wreck a destination. I remember vividly that the influx of Germans into parts of Spain, for example, saw a transformation in the quality of the recycling and really effectively the recycling movement was something that the visitors were insisting on, which was not necessarily taking place prior to that. I think I'm also intrigued as to what the role of smaller group sizes is. This is something that cropped up at destinations the other week when people were talking about something more sort of not more experiential, but a quality of experience which is are substantially different, and that's provided by a small group. Is this something that people are warming to?
I think since COVID, people started thinking more about small groups, semi-private groups, just traveling with people who you know. So I think that's around. Um, a lot of the opportunities to travel out there, of course, are hinged on large group sizes. So again, it has to be that in practice or in theory kind of thing. Like, yes, it would be nice to have a small group, but who's offering small groups and at what price? Does it fit your budget? Does it fit your style? So I think definitely there's still more large group options out there. And there are great small boutique travel agents and companies that are doing that small group or semi-private group.
Yeah, the only thing to point from a commercial point of view, and indeed from a sustainable point of view, is that if you want a more sustainable group, you have a large group. It is much better having 48 people on one vehicle than 48 people split between 4 vehicles. That creates more congestion, more pollution. But hey, it's a different experience. And I must say, it's a different experience. Some people thoroughly enjoy being with a group of 48 people, others don't. It's different strengths for different folks. We have
Yeah,
another
actually,
question.
you're more able to kind of blend in and kind of be invisible in a larger group than a smaller group. So it could be that could also be another way to think of it.
And you're more likely, and it's not, I mean, being on a group tour, and I know that one of the things that people are worried about for the first time is actually not getting on with people on the group. This is a new phenomenon that's occurring. But in general, group tourism is something where you meet people that you get a lot of in general you get along with everyone, and you meet some people you genuinely like. And you're more likely to meet people you genuinely like in a large group than in a small one. But that's maybe my background of being a group tour operator has warped my position of vision on this. I've got a straightforward question coming through. Thank you so much for these questions. Which is, do we know what the proportion of first-time and second-time multiple visitors are to the UK or even to Europe? I may even expand it. I think I don't know if you have that answer. Do you, Robin? I can.
Only for our company, it's about 50-50. And I mean, it's literally like 48 and 52% or something like that. So 1 out of 2 is a new traveler or a first time tour traveler with us to Europe. I was just talking about this the other day, though. It's interesting in our demographics and our statistics to see where first time travelers are choosing to go. And it's also not surprising that often it's Italy or it's big cities. So I think there is still a lot of demand for seeing the kind of great European marquee sites in big cities. And often I think with first-time travelers, those are the places or the things that they've always heard about or they've seen pictures of more than these kind of little villagey backdoor, lesser known sites and destinations and activities. So there's still quite a demand for those big, Venice, Florence, Rome, Paris, London, all of that. But for return travelers, I think they're more likely, for us at least, to want to go a little more in depth in a region, in a country that's maybe less traveled. Yeah.
I think you're dead right. I think that the first time visitor is going to, what is motivating someone to go on a vacation? And the answer is that if you have never been on a vacation, what's going to motivate you is the things that you've heard about and are famous and you are inherently interested in. And so you're going to go for the bucket list is a bit of a derogatory phrase, but you're going to go for the things you've heard about. As a second time visitor, you've got some experience you're falling back on, and you can start exploring it a bit more, and you're more informed. And I think it's entirely natural that the first time visitor goes to see the things they want to see. I think that that's actually it's a real challenge to the operators such as ourselves, such as yourself, and indeed the other prescriptors is probably a bad word, but the tour operators who are taking people around they've got the chance to actually take them up to places other than the main sites. Apart from anything else, you've got to do something where you're going from site to site. And the great news with escorted tours is it is dirigible. I mean, you can actually try and persuade an operator you need to include this, or you should consider including that. No, I think I think the point you made is very valid. What's intriguing is I haven't got the actual metric. I think I understand. I've seen a statistic that says that of the people who've left the United States on one visit, 26%, i.e., 1 in 4, have gone more than once. So they've left more than once. So I would be surprised if that ratio is very different for visitors to Europe or indeed the UK. I would say roughly 1 in 4. I'm sure we could get better data on this, but 1 in 4 visitors are repeat visitors, and 3 out of 4 are first timers. And the good news is that you can't have a repeat visitor without having being a first time visitor to start off with. So both are important because you don't get the second without the first.
And I love all of David's presentations. I love seeing all of the numbers and the ways that he breaks it down. And one thing that's interesting to this conversation that was in his presentation is the age groups coming through to Europe. And you talk about that bucket list traveler, that if you're a first-time traveler, if you're in the age demographic 30 to 44, that's probably a very different list than if you're in an older or a younger age demographic. And from that slide, I know the second largest age demographic was the young people 15 to 29. So if you think of that, think about the difference of a 15-year-old and 29-year-old. Those are going to be very different things that they want to see. I'm assuming the younger age, of course, is from school groups and activities. But there was a good article I read recently, I think it was in a FAR magazine, that talks about how different generations travel now and what motivates different age groups when they're traveling or when they're booking their travel. And it has to do with nostalgia, it has to do with experiences, it has to do with, I think the younger demographic, if I'm remembering the article, was the one who was more focused on experiences, where the older demographics were more, they wanted to do everything because maybe they hadn't been to Europe before, so this was going to be their one big trip to go, so let's just pack it with everything. So that was a good article and maybe give some insight to people working with different age demographics.
Yeah, I agree. I think I also would stress people looking at the demographic, and if you look broadly in the world, the US, oddly enough, is an outlier on this, but if you're looking at demand from Asia, for example, for Europe, which I know is not the topic of conversation here, but it's something that's pressing on me. The demographic time bomb is the fact that everyone's getting much older. What we're looking at is a huge explosion of the baby boomers coming into money, retirement, and they're in a position to travel. So I think you rightly look at the youth market, and one is rightly naturally intrigued as to what they want and how they're getting up to things. But the big money, I would ascertain, is in the 55 to 85 bracket, because those are the guys with the money and the time, and maybe even the inclination to go traveling.
And I guess what I'm saying about that demographic is they want different things than the younger demographic, and they require different things in terms of hotels and activities that maybe the 15 to 29 or the 30 to 44-year-olds are going to require.
No, I agree. Unless they're very badly behaved.
Yeah.
Could happen. Okay, I think we've run through the questions, and we've got one more. Great, thank you so much. They're asking, with more competitive transatlantic airfares on offer due to subdued demand, so the subdued demand is taken as a given here, outbound from Europe to US. All right, so they're saying there's subdued demand, there's known subdued demand from Europe to US, and this is actually the side of the coin we haven't looked at. Do you think that ticket price softening will help support demand into Europe? So if I can just expand on that, they're saying that there's a notable sort of dying off of demand from global demand, really, from the United States, not just from Canada, but from Europe and from elsewhere. And this is a unique phenomenon because normally people don't don't let political considerations affect their travel too much. Some extraordinary places have enjoyed travel booms. I mean, I just merely say that in Spain under Franco, Greece under the general rule, Thailand under military dictatorship. There's several examples of destinations still attracting lots and lots of visitors, irrespective of their political persuasion. It's possible what's happening in America is more to do with people actually genuinely concerned and not necessarily very well informed, but naturally concerned about what's happening to one or two visitors upon arrival in the United States. These stories are going global. But do you think this is going to lead to lower airfares? There are few people traveling between Europe and America. And if there are a few lower airfares, will that help demand in the United States? I think that's the sort of supposition. Robin, over to you to answer.
Oh gosh, that's a big one to answer. The airlines are a mystery. I don't know. I feel like airline prices have been up for years now, and I look back fondly to the days where you could get a round trip airfare to Europe for under $1,000, and I don't think we're ever going to see those days again. So even if the lower demand of Europeans traveling to Europe will decrease prices, I think those days are really gone. Living in Seattle, we see during the summer, we see way more international flights coming into Seattle because that's where the cruise ships leave to go up to Alaska. So it is a seasonal thing that I think probably plays a factor in that. And it was interesting again to hear David talk about the World Cup taking place in the United States next summer. I guess perhaps that could drive demand to the United States, which then would lessen demand to Europe and lower airfare. But yeah, it'll be a roller coaster like it is every year. And I think airfare is just something I put up with now in my travels. It's an unknown cost that I accept because I prioritize traveling.
Okay, I think we could have a separate discussion on mega sporting events and tourism demand, which is one of our favourite subjects. But I will defer that for a little bit. It's really up to thank you. I will thank David for giving his presentation. Not that he's here to hear the thanks. Thank you, Robin, for getting up quite so early in Seattle. I think there are, incidentally, $1,000 airfares to Europe, but they're in the East Coast, not the West Coast.
I'm biased. You're right.
But without a parting shot, I would just say thank you so much for getting up early in the morning in what looks like a beautiful day on the West Coast of America. It's goodbye from me from a comparatively chilly London. And thank you, the audience, for listening to us. It's been great having you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.